The capture. The morning fog clung to the French countryside like a shroud as Oberleutnant Greta Muller adjusted her Wehrmacht auxiliary uniform for what would be the last time as a free woman. April 1945 had brought nothing but retreat, chaos, and the bitter taste of defeat. The communications unit she commanded, 12 women who had spent the war intercepting Allied transmissions and managing field communications, now huddled in the basement of an abandoned farmhouse outside Strasbourg. The sound of American tanks rumbling through the village streets above sent tremors through the stone walls. Greta looked at her companions. Helga, the robust radio operator from Bavaria. Anneliese, the soft-spoken cryptographer from Berlin. Young Liesel, barely 19, who still cried for her mother at night. And the others, each carrying the weight of a dying regime on their shoulders. "They're here," whispered Frida, pulling back from the small window that offered a view of the street. Her voice carried neither fear nor relief, only exhaustion. Greta had made her decision hours ago. They had destroyed their documents, disabled their equipment, and removed all insignia that might identify their specific unit. She had heard the stories, some true, many exaggerated, about what happened to captured German soldiers. But they had also heard other stories, whispered accounts of American treatment that seemed too good to be true. "We surrender," Greta announced firmly. "Remove all weapons. Hands visible at all times. We are communications personnel, non-combatants." "Helga, you speak English. You'll translate." The heavy boots on the stairs came quickly. The door burst open, and American soldiers flooded in, rifles raised, shouting commands in English that most of the women couldn't understand. Greta raised her hands high, noting the surprise on the young GI's face when he realized they were women. "We surrender," Helga said in careful English. "We are unarmed. We are a communications unit. We surrender." The American sergeant, a weathered man with kind eyes that seemed out of place in a combat zone, lowered his rifle slowly. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered. "Women soldiers. Get 'em upstairs, boys. Easy now, they're cooperating." As they were led out into the pale morning light, Greta saw the destruction that war had brought to this once peaceful village. Burned buildings, cratered streets, and the haunted faces of French civilians watching from broken windows. She felt shame wash over her, though she had never fired a shot, never harmed a civilian. She had only listened to voices in the dark, translated codes, managed communications that helped a war machine she had long stopped believing in. They were loaded into the back of a truck with surprising gentleness. The American soldiers weren't cruel or violent. They seemed almost embarrassed by their captives. One young private, red-haired with freckles that made him look like a schoolboy, offered them cigarettes. Most refused, but Frida took one with shaking hands. "Where are they taking us?" whispered Liesel, clutching Anneliese's arm. "A camp, probably," Greta replied. "A prisoner of war camp." "Will they—" Liesel couldn't finish the sentence, but they all knew what she meant. "The Americans follow the Geneva Convention," Helga said quietly. "I heard that from the French resistance women before we retreated. They treat prisoners according to international law." As the truck rumbled through the French countryside, heading west toward the American lines, Greta watched Germany, or what remained of it, disappear behind them. They had lost everything: their country, their cause, their freedom. All that remained was survival, and whatever came next in the hands of their captors. The journey lasted 3 hours. When the truck finally stopped, they found themselves at a large compound surrounded by barbed wire, filled with rows of identical tents. American flags snapped in the spring breeze. Guards stood at attention, but not with the harsh rigidity of German sentries. There was an ease to them, a confidence of victory that needed no reinforcement. "Welcome to Camp Lucky Strike," the sergeant announced as the tailgate dropped. "You'll be processed here. Follow orders, don't cause trouble, and you'll be treated fair." Greta stepped down from the truck, her legs stiff from the ride, and looked at the faces of her companions. They were prisoners now, but they were alive. In April 1945, that alone seemed like a miracle. First impressions. The processing center was unlike anything Greta had imagined. instead of the harsh interrogations and brutal treatment she'd heard about in Wehrmacht propaganda. They were led into a large tent where American clerks, both men and women in crisp uniforms, sat behind makeshift desks with typewriters and stacks of forms. A female U.S. Army officer approached them, her uniform immaculate despite the field conditions. She was perhaps 30, with sharp features and observant brown eyes. "I'm Captain Morrison," she said in flawless German. "I'll be overseeing your intake. You will be treated in accordance with the Geneva Convention. You'll receive food, shelter, and medical care. In return, we expect cooperation and truthful answers to our questions." The women exchanged glances. The efficiency was startling, but so was the civility. No one had been struck, insulted, or threatened. One by one, they were called forward for interviews. When Greta's turn came, she sat across from Captain Morrison, acutely aware of her dirty uniform and unwashed hair. The American officer pushed a form across the table along with a pencil. "Full name, rank, unit, and hometown," Morrison instructed. "You're required to provide only basic information under international law. We won't interrogate you about military secrets or force information from you." Greta filled out the form carefully. "May I ask a question?" "Go ahead. What will happen to us?" Morrison's expression softened slightly. "You'll be held here until the war ends, which won't be long now. Then you'll be repatriated to Germany for demobilization. The process may take months, but you're safe here. You'll be assigned to the women's compound, separate from male prisoners." After processing, they were led through the camp. The scale shocked them. Thousands of prisoners, both German and Italian, housed in sprawling tent cities. But what struck Greta most was the atmosphere. Prisoners walked freely within their compounds, played cards, read books. Guards were present, but not oppressive. Their section was a smaller compound within a larger camp, housing roughly 200 female prisoners, Wehrmacht auxiliaries, nurses, communications personnel, and a handful of captured Luftwaffe support staff. The tents were military standard, canvas stretched over wooden frames, but each had cots with actual mattresses, blankets, and a small stove for heating. "This is better than our last 3 billets in France," Frida observed, testing the cot with her hand. "Remember that barn in Metz? Sleeping on hay with rats. Don't get comfortable," Annalise warned. "They're probably softening us up for interrogation." But the interrogation never came. Instead, that evening, they received their first meal as prisoners of war. The experience would become one they would recount for the rest of their lives. The feast. At 1800 hours, a whistle blew across the women's compound. "Chow time," an American guard called out in broken German. "Form lines at the mess tent." The women emerged from their tents cautiously, following the flow of other female prisoners toward a large mess tent at the compound center. The aroma that wafted from within was unlike anything Greta had smelled in months. Rich, savory, impossibly abundant. Inside, American soldiers stood behind long tables laden with food. Real food. Not the ersatz coffee and black bread that had sustained them for the past year. Not the thin soup or mysterious meat that German field rations had become, but actual abundant food. "Mein Gott," Helga breathed beside Greta. "Is this real?" Each woman was handed a metal tray divided into sections, American mess kits. The first server, a cheerful black corporal with a Louisiana drawl, began piling food onto Greta's tray before she could even comprehend what was happening. "We got roast beef tonight, ma'am," he said, dropping a thick slice of actual beef on her tray. "Mashed potatoes and gravy, green beans, fresh bread, butter, the real stuff, not margarine, and apple pie for dessert. You drink coffee or tea?" Greta stared at her tray, unable to speak. The portion was enormous, more food than she'd seen on a single plate in 2 years. Beside the main meal, there was a small salad with actual lettuce and tomatoes, a pat of yellow butter on the bread, and a cup of coffee that smelled like actual coffee, not the roasted grain substitute they'd been drinking. "I think she's in shock, Willie," another server commented. "First day jitters," Willie replied kindly. "Go on, miss. Find a seat. Eat up. We got plenty." Greta moved through the line in a daze. watching as her companions received similarly laden trays. They found seats at one of the long wooden tables, surrounded by other German women who were eating with expressions ranging from disbelief to tears. "This has to be a trick," Anneliese said. But even as she spoke, she was cutting into her beef with a knife that actually cut cleanly. Liesel had already taken a bite. Her eyes widened, and tears began streaming down her cheeks. "It's real," she whispered. "It's really real food." The meat was tender, seasoned with herbs they'd forgotten existed. The mashed potatoes were creamy and rich with butter. The gravy was thick and savory. The bread was soft and white, not the dense black bread of wartime rationing. Each bite was a revelation, a reminder of a world before war and privation. Around them, the conversations began, first whispered, then louder as the reality sank in. They have so much food. In Germany, the children are starving, and here, the butter alone would feed a family for a week back home. "They eat like kings," Frida exclaimed, her voice carrying across the mess tent. "The Americans eat like kings." An older woman at the next table, a Wehrmacht nurse from Munich, overheard and laughed bitterly. "Not kings, dear. This is how ordinary American soldiers eat. Every day, while we starved and told ourselves we were winning the war." The implications settled over the table like a weight. If this was standard rations for prisoners, what did that say about America's resources? About Germany's position? About the lies they'd been told? Greta looked at the apple pie on her tray, golden crust flaking under her fork, cinnamon-scented filling oozing out. She thought of the propaganda films she'd seen, showing Americans as decadent and weak, their society on the verge of collapse. She thought of the ration cards back home, the empty shops, the hungry faces. "We never had a chance, did we?" she said quietly to Helga. Helga, mouthful of mashed potatoes, shook her head. Not if they could feed their prisoners like this while fighting a war on 2 continents. Not if this is what they consider basic rations. Adjusting to abundance. The following days brought a series of revelations that fundamentally changed how the German women understood the war they had lost. Each morning began with breakfast, real eggs, bacon or sausage, toast with jam, orange juice or milk, and coffee. The first time Greta saw fresh oranges at breakfast, she actually gasped. "Where do they get all this?" Liesel asked, cradling an orange like it was made of gold. "We haven't seen citrus fruit in Germany since before the war. They ship it from America," explained Margot, an older prisoner who had been captured 3 weeks earlier during the Rhine crossing. I asked one of the guards. "They have ships full of supplies coming across the Atlantic constantly. Food, ammunition, fuel, medicine, everything. The Atlantic isn't even fully secured, and they still manage it." The abundance wasn't limited to food. The women received basic toiletries, real soap that lathered, toothpaste, even sanitary supplies. There was a shower facility with hot water, available every other day. Clean clothes were provided, prisoner uniforms in plain gray, but clean and whole without the patches and repairs that had characterized German military uniforms for the past 2 years. What shocked Greta most was the medical care. A young woman in their tent, Katerina, had been suffering from a persistent cough. When it worsened, the American medics didn't ignore it or provide minimal treatment. They took her to the camp hospital, x-rayed her chest, diagnosed pneumonia, and treated her with a drug called penicillin. "It's a miracle medicine," Katerina explained when she returned 3 days later, already looking healthier. "The American doctor said it saves thousands of lives. They use it on everyone, soldiers, prisoners, even civilians. In Germany, we heard it existed, but we never had access to it." Captain Morrison visited their section regularly, checking on conditions and addressing concerns through interpreters. During one visit, Greta gathered the courage to ask the question that had been haunting her. "Captain, why do you treat us so well? We are your enemies." Morrison's response was matter of fact. "You're prisoners of war, entitled to humane treatment under international law. But more than that, Lieutenant Muller, we believe that how we treat our enemies says something about who we are. We're not fighting to brutalize people. We're fighting to end brutality." The words stayed with Greta, especially when she thought about the camps she'd heard rumors of whispered stories about places in Poland and Germany that the SS ran. She'd always dismissed them as Allied propaganda, but now she wondered. The women began to establish routines. They were given duties, cleaning, laundry, some administrative work for those who spoke English. The work was light, nothing like the grinding labor they'd endured during the war's final months. In the evenings, they had free time. Some women read books from the camp library, others played cards or wrote letters home, though it was unclear when or if those letters would be delivered. Greta observed everything with the analytical mind that had made her a good communications officer. She noticed how the American guards rotated regularly, how they maintained discipline without cruelty, how the camp was organized with efficient precision. She noticed the casual way American soldiers interacted with each other, the lack of rigid hierarchy in informal settings, the easy laughter even in a military zone. One afternoon, watching American soldiers play baseball beyond the compound fence, Frida said what they were all thinking. They're not what we were told. The propaganda painted them as soft, undisciplined, barely soldiers at all. But look at them. They're just different. Their strength comes from something other than what we were taught made armies strong. Choice, Helga said quietly. They chose to be here. They volunteered to cross an ocean to fight a war that wasn't directly threatening their homeland. That's a different kind of soldier than one fighting because a totalitarian government demanded it. Breaking through propaganda. 3 weeks into their captivity, the women's compound received an unexpected visitor. A U.S. Army chaplain, Father O'Brien, began holding services on Sunday mornings for those who wished to attend. The first week, only a handful of Catholic women showed up, suspicious of American religious influence. Greta wasn't particularly religious. The war had tested what little faith she'd had, but she went the second week out of curiosity. She found Father O'Brien to be a gentle man in his 50s, Irish by heritage, who conducted Mass in serviceable Latin and offered sermons in broken German. After the service, he lingered to speak with the women. "I know this is difficult," he said, struggling with German grammar. "Being prisoner, being far from home, being uncertain of future. But you are not forgotten. You are not alone. Why do you come here?" Annalise asked, her voice sharp with suspicion. "To convert us? To gather information?" Father O'Brien smiled sadly. "I come because Christ commanded care for prisoners. Your flag, my flag. These things matter to nations. To God, you are simply his children in need of comfort." The simple humanity of the gesture broke something in Liesel. She began to cry, really cry, for the first time since their capture. Father O'Brien didn't try to stop her or make her feel ashamed. He simply waited, offering a clean handkerchief. "I'm so confused," Liesel admitted through her tears. "We were told Americans were the enemy, that they wanted to destroy Germany, destroy us. But they feed us better than our own army did. They give us medicine. They treat us like people. War makes enemies of people who might otherwise be friends," Father O'Brien replied. "The shooting stops, and we remember we are all human." That conversation sparked others. The women began talking more openly about their experiences, comparing notes about what they'd been told versus what they'd observed. The cognitive dissonance was painful. "Do you remember the newsreels?" Margot asked one evening as they sat in their tent. "The ones showing American cities in chaos, food riots, economic collapse." "Propaganda," Greta said flatly. "Obviously, no nation in economic collapse feeds its prisoners roast beef and apple pie. But if that was propaganda, what else was?" Frida wondered. What else were we told that was lies? The question hung in the air, heavy with implications. Slowly, reluctantly, the women began sharing things they'd heard, rumors and whispers that German authorities had dismissed as enemy lies. Stories about camps in the East, about trains full of Jews that never came back, about systematic killings. "My neighbor in Berlin," Annalise said quietly, "was Jewish. Her family was taken in 1943. She was 8 years old. I was told they were being resettled in the East, given farmland. But she was 8. What would an 8-year-old do on a farm?" "We heard stories at the communications post," Helga admitted. "Intercepted transmissions, things that were immediately classified and removed from our logs. References to to activities we weren't allowed to question. I volunteered for the Wehrmacht, Greta said, her voice hollow. I thought I was serving my country, defending Germany against enemies who wanted to destroy us. What if we were the enemy all along? The conversation was interrupted by Captain Morrison, who entered the tent with unusual formality. Ladies, tomorrow morning there will be a mandatory assembly. The camp commander has important information to share with all prisoners. The truth revealed. The next morning, April 30th, 1945, all prisoners in Camp Lucky Strike were assembled in a large open area. Armed guards lined the perimeter. More than usual, their faces grim. A screen had been erected, and a film projector stood ready. Greta felt a knot of dread in her stomach. Whatever was coming, it was significant. The camp commander, Colonel Henderson, took the stage. His expression was severe, his jaw tight. He spoke in English first, then waited for translators to relay his words in German, Italian, and French. Prisoners of war, you are about to see footage captured by Allied forces during the liberation of German concentration camps. This material is graphic and disturbing. However, it is necessary that you see what was done in your nation's name. You are required to watch. You will not look away. The projector clicked to life. The film began. For the next 45 minutes, Greta witnessed horrors that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Mountains of skeletal corpses bulldozed into mass graves. Living prisoners who looked more like ghosts than humans, their eyes hollow with suffering. Gas chambers disguised as showers. Crematoria. Children's shoes in massive piles. Human hair, gold teeth, possessions of the murdered stored in warehouses. The footage came from Buchenwald, Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, camps that many of the German prisoners had heard of but told themselves were just labor camps. Harsh perhaps, but necessary for the war effort. The reality shown on screen bore no resemblance to those comfortable lies. Around Greta, women were crying, vomiting, fainting. Some shouted that it was fake, Allied propaganda designed to break their spirits. But the footage was too real, too detailed, too consistent across multiple camps. American and British soldiers appeared in the films, their faces registering the same shock and horror that Greta felt. One segment showed German civilians from nearby towns being forced to tour the camps to see what had been hidden behind barbed wire and secrecy. Their reactions mirrored what Greta felt: denial, disgust, shame. When the film ended and the lights came back on, the assembly ground was silent except for the sound of weeping. Colonel Henderson returned to the podium. "This is what Nazi Germany created," he said, his voice hard. "This is what your government did, while telling you it was defending civilization. Some of you may claim ignorance. Some of you may have genuinely not known. But you cannot claim ignorance now. You will carry this knowledge back to Germany. You will tell others what you saw here today. History will not be allowed to forget, and neither will you." The prisoners were dismissed back to their compounds. Greta walked in a daze, her mind unable to process what she'd seen. Around her, women were arguing, some still insisting it was propaganda, others defending the indefensible, claiming military necessity or blaming others. But most were simply silent, devastated. Back in their tent, the women of Greta's unit sat in shocked silence. Finally, Annalise spoke. "My neighbor, the little girl, is this what happened to her?" No one answered because they all knew. "We were part of it," Frida said, her voice breaking. "We didn't pull triggers or open gas chambers, but we were part of the system. We wore the uniform. We followed orders. We didn't ask questions." "I asked questions," Helga said bitterly. "I was told it wasn't my concern. I was told to focus on my duty. I was told that spreading rumors was treason." Greta felt the weight of her uniform, now exchanged for prisoner gray, as if it were made of lead. She thought of all the times she'd heard whispers, noticed inconsistencies, felt uneasy about certain orders or operations. She told herself she was just a communications officer, that she wasn't responsible for policy, that following orders was her duty. "They fed us propaganda," she said finally. "But at some point we chose to believe it. We chose not to question. We chose comfort over conscience." Liesel, who had been silent since the screening, spoke up in a small voice. "What do we do now?" It was the question they would all struggle with for years to come. Reckoning. The days following the film screening were dark ones in the women's compound. The abundance that had shocked them now felt like judgment. Why should they eat well when millions had starved in camps? Some women stopped eating, consumed by guilt. Others became angry, lashing out at guards or fellow prisoners. A few attempted self-harm and had to be placed under medical supervision. Captain Morrison increased her presence in the compound, bringing with her a team of doctors and counselors. At assembly one morning, she addressed the women directly. "What you saw was real," she began in German. "It happened. Your government did this. But here is what I need you to understand. Guilt is not the same as responsibility. You must acknowledge what was done. You must carry that knowledge. But you must also live with it, learn from it, and eventually return home to help build something better." She paused, letting the words settle. Germany will need people who understand what went wrong, who can teach the next generation, who can say never again and mean it. You can choose to be destroyed by what you learned, or you can choose to be part of the rebuilding. The words resonated with some, fell flat with others. Greta found herself somewhere in between, caught between horror at the past and uncertainty about the future. Father O'Brien increased his visits, offering not religious conversion, but simply space for grief and questions. In one conversation that Greta would remember forever, he told her, "God gave us free will, and that means we can choose terrible evil. But it also means we can choose redemption. Not forgetting, never forgetting, but choosing to do better." Slowly, the compound began to function again. Women returned to their duties, ate their meals, maintained routines. But they were changed. Conversations turned to difficult questions. What signs had they missed? What could they have done differently? What would they tell their children about these years? One evening, Greta organized a meeting of the women in her tent. "We need to talk about what we're going to do when we go home," she said. "Germany is defeated. The Nazis are finished. We're going to return to a destroyed country that will have to rebuild not just its buildings, but its entire moral foundation. If we go home," Annalise said darkly, "who knows what will happen to us?" "We will go home," Helga said firmly. "The Geneva Convention requires it. The Americans have followed every other rule. They'll follow that one too. The question is what kind of Germany we'll go home to." They talked late into the night, sometimes arguing, sometimes crying, sometimes just sitting in silence. They discussed what they would tell people, how they would explain, whether they should speak publicly or try to fade into obscurity. "I'm going to become a teacher," Liesel announced suddenly. "If I survive, if I make it home, I'm going to teach children. And I'm going to make sure they know the truth about what happened. Not propaganda, not comfortable lies. The truth." Others made similar vows. Margot, the nurse, committed to working in public health. Frida wanted to help rebuild social services. Annalise, the cryptographer, dreamed of studying history, documenting what had happened so future generations couldn't deny it. Greta wasn't sure what her future held, but she knew one thing. She would never again accept comfortable lies over difficult truths. Liberation and legacy. On May 8th, 1945, the war in Europe officially ended. The news was announced over the camp's loudspeakers, first in English, then in multiple languages. In the women's compound, the reaction was complex: relief that the killing had stopped, grief for what was lost, anxiety about what came next. The American soldiers celebrated, but not cruelly. No one came to gloat over the German prisoners. Instead, that evening's meal was expanded. More food, even small portions of ice cream, a luxury that made some women weep. "They celebrate defeating us by feeding us ice cream," Frida observed, shaking her head. "Who are these people?" In the weeks that followed, the camp began processing prisoners for repatriation. The system was orderly but slow. Germany was devastated, its infrastructure destroyed, its cities in ruins. Transportation was limited, and the Allies had to prioritize. Captain Morrison visited their tent one final time before being reassigned. "You'll be going home soon," she told them. "The process is beginning. You'll return through Frankfurt, where you'll be officially demobilized and released." "What will we find there?" Greta asked. Morrison's expression was sympathetic but honest. "Destruction. hunger, chaos. The Germany you knew doesn't exist anymore. But you've survived this far, and you've learned important lessons. Use them. The day finally came in late June. Greta and her unit, along with hundreds of other female prisoners, boarded trains heading east. As they crossed into Germany, the devastation became apparent. Bombed-out cities, destroyed bridges, refugees on every road. They were processed at a demobilization center in Frankfurt, given civilian clothes to replace their prisoner uniforms, and provided with basic documentation. Then they were released, free to find their way home if home still existed. Greta's companions scattered to different parts of Germany. They promised to write, to find each other again someday, but none of them knew if they'd keep those promises. Liesel was heading to Hamburg, Helga to Munich, Anneliese back to what remained of Berlin. Greta herself returned to Cologne, or what was left of it. The city she'd left in 1941 was gone, replaced by ruins and rubble. Her family home was damaged but standing, and by some miracle, her mother had survived. Their reunion was tearful and complicated. Her mother wanted to hear about the war, but Greta didn't know how to explain what she'd learned. Over the following weeks, as they worked to repair the house and survive in a country without functioning systems, Greta slowly shared pieces of her story. She told her mother about the abundance of American rations, about being fed better as a prisoner than as a soldier. She told her about the film she'd been forced to watch, about the camps, about the truth of what Nazi Germany had done. Her mother resisted at first, unable or unwilling to believe, but Greta persisted. "We have to face this, Mama," she said. "All of us. Every German. We have to acknowledge what was done in our name. Otherwise, we're no better than those who did it." In the years that followed, Greta did what she'd promised herself she would do. She spoke publicly about her experiences, wrote articles, testified when called upon. She faced hostility from those who wanted to forget, who accused her of being a traitor or spreading Allied lies. But she also found others like her, Germans who had seen the truth and committed to ensuring it was never forgotten. Liesel became the teacher she'd dreamed of being, incorporating lessons about Nazi atrocities into her curriculum despite conservative pushback. Helga worked with international aid organizations, helping rebuild German civil society. Anneliese became a historian, specializing in the war years. They remained friends, writing letters, visiting when possible. They met up every year on April 15th, the anniversary of their capture, to remember where they'd been and how far they'd come. In 1985, 40 years after their capture, the surviving members of their unit, now elderly women, were invited to give a lecture at a German university about their experiences. Greta, Helga, and Liesel stood before a room full of students and told their story. "We thought we were patriots," Greta told them. "We thought we were serving our country. We were told lies, and we chose to believe them because the truth was too uncomfortable. By the time we realized what we'd been part of, it was too late to stop it." She paused, looking at the young faces before her, students who had grown up in a democratic Germany, who couldn't imagine the world she described. "But here's what I want you to understand," she continued. "It can happen again. Not exactly the same way. History doesn't repeat, it rhymes. But the patterns are there. The scapegoating, the propaganda, the erosion of truth, the normalization of cruelty. You must be vigilant. You must question. You must never be so comfortable that you look away from injustice." A student raised her hand. "What made you finally understand? What broke through the propaganda?" Greta smiled sadly. "Being fed like a king when we'd been told our enemies were starving. Sometimes the smallest truths reveal the biggest lies. Those American rations weren't just food. They were evidence of a reality we'd been denied. They showed us that everything we'd been told was backwards." After the lecture, students crowded around them with questions. One young woman, serious and earnest, asked Liesel, "Do you think Germany has truly learned from this? Are we different now?" Liesel, white-haired but still sharp-eyed, considered the question carefully. "Germany has learned. Whether it's learned enough, whether the lessons will last beyond our generation, that's up to you. We can tell you what happened. We can warn you. But you have to choose what to do with that knowledge." As the three old women left the university that evening, Walking slowly through streets that had been rebuilt from rubble, Greta thought about the long, strange journey from that French farmhouse to this moment. They had been enemies, then prisoners, then witnesses, and finally teachers. They eat like kings, Frida had said all those years ago, shocked by American rations. But the real gift America had given them wasn't food. It was the forced confrontation with truth. That gift had been painful, devastating even, but it had also been necessary. Germany had lost the war, but for Greta and her companions, defeat had been the beginning of understanding. And understanding, however painful, was the first step towards something better. She would never forget the taste of that first American meal, the abundance that had seemed impossible. But more than that, she would never forget what that abundance revealed, that they had been lied to, that their cause had been unjust, that the only path forward was through acknowledgement and change. The story of their capture and imprisonment was, in the end, a story of unexpected liberation, not from barbed wire and guards, but from lies, propaganda, and the comfortable blindness of unexamined loyalty. They had eaten like kings as prisoners of war, but they had learned to think like free people, and that was a far more valuable meal. Retry.